evening, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening. You know, I always feel like Ray Kinsella with all these. Build it, they will come. So this is very exciting for us to have you here tonight. And for those of you who have been here before, to our other talks earlier this year, you have seen the transformation of this classroom. Isn't this wonderful with the glass up and everything, and just really a really nice room for this type of presentation. So thank you for coming. This is the first of one of our programs that we hope to have throughout the year, celebrating our National Archives Month, which is celebrated during the month of October. We want to look at the cultural diversity of Wyoming. So our first speaker this evening is Dan Lyon. And I want to introduce you to a couple of people before we get started. As you know, we have Susie Taylor, our reference archivist, who's also doing double duty as the videographer. And then we have Sarah Davis, our state archivist. Sarah just joined our group in September, and we're glad to have her aboard. Okay. And I'm Robin Everett. I work in the archives also. So remember to silence your cell phones. We don't want anybody's alarms going off. Okay, the restrooms are around the corner, back by the elevators. Dan Lyon is 100% Japanese on his mom's side, but he doesn't have a family history in Wyoming prior to the mid-1960s. He was inspired the research of the forgotten history of the Japanese railroad community excuse me, in Cheyenne by Jim Allison. I'm sorry, I have a really dry throat. The Wyoming State Museum collection supervisor, who by the way is retiring, and Dan's desire to uncover and share the forgotten stories of the many immigrants buried in the Japanese plot and Potter's Field at Lakeview Cemetery through published works and presentations. Dan developed an interest in the military and Wyoming's forgotten history while assigned to Warren, ICBM, and Heritage Museum at the F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming. During his assignment, he contributed to the museum's selection twice for the Air Force Space Command Museum of the Year Award. And Dan is an accomplished and award-winning writer and the author of The Wyoming Girl Guards, The Forgotten Women's Militia, published by the History Press. We had hoped to have the museum store open this evening so that you could go in and buy his book if you wanted to, but they had a miscommunication, but there is copies available at the museum store, excuse me, if you'd like to purchase it. And if you want to make arrangements, we can make arrangements to have Dan sign it for you afterwards. Okay? So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. You're on.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and welcome to People in the High Plains. Tonight's overview is about the adversity early Japanese immigrants to Wyoming faced as they tried to realize their American dream of prosperity while working for the Union Pacific Railroad in the early 1900s. Now, this presentation is not about my family roots because we come to Wyoming from England in the mid-1960s. I, however, will share with you some snippets of other family histories from people I met during my research into this fascinating subject. We'll also explore Cheyenne's forgotten Japanese town, the Japanese plot at Lakeview Cemetery, as well as the community's attempt to assimilate the Japanese into Western culture. I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Dan, did you do your own graphics?
I did. So the Japanese immigrants came to Wyoming to seek their American dreams. That was in 1900. However, they do have a history prior to 1900. They came to Granger, Wyoming in 1892. They built the Oregon Short Line Railroad line from Huntington to Granger, Wyoming. That's 500 miles, and there are 40 of them. Now, they didn't cause too much excitement back then. The excitement all started in the 1900s when America felt that there were too many Japanese coming to the United States. The reason why they came is the Union Pacific had a plan, a $5 million upgrade of its lines in Wyoming that included double tracking. In the Laramie area, they wanted to build a tunnel a mile long through some solid granite. They were going to reconstruct bridges and build bridges, and they moved 800,000 cubic yards of granite. So they needed some help, and people were not lining up to take these jobs because the job was very dangerous. And here's the reason why the Japanese were hated: organized labor and newspapers. Organized labor, they said that the Japanese were taking jobs from the white man, and that they were bringing wages down because they worked for coolie wages. They earned $1.25 a day. That was 30 to 50% less than what other white immigrants earned. And newspapers hated them because it was good for circulations. This was the time of yellow journalism. We had Pulitzer over here, and we had Hearst over here, and they were trying to sell newspapers. So they created headlines that were very sensational, and they went with a tabloid style of news reporting. They played loose with the facts, and the Japanese, hey, they were just fair game. And if you put them in the paper and build them up, pretty soon you can sell a lot of papers. But the most important thing is the Union Pacific loved them. They loved them because they were industrial. They were also inexpensive, so that was good for the bottom line. And you see, this is a sample of one of the newspaper's headlines: Japanese are a failure. And this one said that there were only 40 Japanese employed on the lines in Wyoming. Well, if you want to do the fact check, the Japanese had 1,574 people here. In fact, they were not a problem. You can see the other nationalities above them. So, were the Japanese flooding the market? No. Another thing to like the Japanese is most of them spoke English. I figured at least 60%. You look at this one right here, only 5 people on the list do not speak English. The Japanese also had a program. If they had a co-worker that did not understand English, they would teach them 3 words a day. Pretty soon, over time, you become very proficient. The Japanese also took the Union Pacific courses, which taught you how to do your job, and they translated them from English into Japanese. So everyone understood their job. So that's why the Union Pacific loved the Japanese. They loved them so much, they thought they were proficient, that 74% of the foremen on the Wyoming lines were Japanese. 96 out of 123 were Japanese. They worked well with their countrymen. They worked well with other immigrants. But, you know, the big theme throughout history was we have too many Japanese, so there was legislation passed. There was something called the Gentleman's Agreement that was passed in 1907. Basically, it tried to limit the influx of Japanese into the markets. Well, the Japanese complied to an extent, except for they found a way to illegally come from the Canadian border and the Mexican border. But the Japanese also did something to draw back on their numbers here in Wyoming as well. They actually recalled 600 Japanese workers in Wyoming because Japan was at war with Russia, and these workers were conscripted into the Japanese army. So it was a voluntary recall of some labor, but that didn't get too much press. So these are some of the headlines that you find. The objections Japanese, they called them little brown men, they called them yellow, they called them Japs, and they said that they were taking the place of the white man. So they said they were evil. And all this led to riots against the Japanese. It all built up and boiled over. There were riots in San Francisco, Bellingham, Washington, Vancouver, British Columbia, and even in Laramie, Wyoming. 3 days of rioting in Laramie, Wyoming. That's when the boys of Laramie stoned the Japanese, vandalized businesses. They even lassoed one Japanese man and dragged him through the streets. Fortunately, no one was killed. So here we have a map of where the Japanese were distributed, and I call this my nerd out slide because my buddy Dave Markham and I used to have nerd out sessions. So here we have 160. That's the total number of Japanese that originally came to Wyoming in 1900. They came to Evanston, Wyoming. That was kind of the western headquarters there. So if you come to the capital city, which was eastern headquarters, we had one Japanese here in Cheyenne in 1900, according to the census. The Japanese arrived after the census was enumerated, and I figure there are about 50 to 55 here, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Soon, a couple months after the census, it said that 500 Japanese were coming, and this is partially true because they did come to Wyoming, but they were dispersed. I figured Cheyenne had a standing population of about 300, so you probably added another 299. We know that 160 went to Denver. There were some railroad strikes in the area. Some went up to the mines in Sunrise. Those were company-owned mines in Sunrise. And then others were dispersed between here and Omaha. And so that's our little Denver guy. And in Laramie, we had 15 Japanese. And so during the riot, you had 15 Japanese against a population of 8,200. And so figure out how many boys there. It's not an equal fight. So Japanese in Wyoming in 1900, there were a total of 393 out of a population of 93,000 plus. So way less than 0.5% of the population. Evanston had 75. Sweetwater, which is the mining district, had 249. Again, Laramie 15, and Cheyenne we say 1, but that was, we're going to skip that one there. So this is one I borrowed from Ara Newland. I met her during a Japanese American group panel hosted by Bart Mountain, and she had relatives that lived in the Rock Springs area. And this is a cool sign. We are not foreign, we are from Wyoming. The Japanese made an attempt to assimilate themselves into society. but they couldn't become an American citizen. They couldn't own land. Many of them registered for the draft during World War I to show their loyalty. And that registering for the draft was kind of a pathway to citizenship, but they were not going to get citizenship because Japanese going to become naturalized citizen according to law. But many did establish roots here in Wyoming. One of them was Nikichi Hamada. He was from Rock Springs, and he was kind of the Japanese Superman of the day. The photo and the story is courtesy of Don Lyon. He is another one I met on the Japanese root panel. Now, Don tells the story that this cart full of ore rolled down a hill in one of the mines, and the miners tried to pull that cart back up onto level track, and they were unable to do that. Well, Don's grandfather went and strapped himself to the cart, and by himself pulled that cart back onto level ground. And then, let's go up north. We have a story that I borrowed from Aura. Her grandfather set up a laundry business. Now, that's not really unusual, but the location is. He set up his tent, laundry tent, in Yellowstone National Park. Yeah, he had plenty of hot water and plenty of tourists that needed their laundry done. Okay. And then this is one from Sheridan. This is one that Robin and I we're helping someone discover their roots. Catherine's done an amazing job of finding more about her grandfather. He was a farmer up in Sheridan, and you can see the traditional Japanese farming technique where they covered their produce to protect it from the sun and insects. And there are other different methods that they used. And Benny Shibata, he's down there in Laramie. Benny was one of the more interesting characters in Laramie. Again, Japanese couldn't own land, so his nephew bought him a house. And every morning people would see Benny walking his cows out there, giving them exercises. At night, he would tuck them into bed because they were his roommates in the house. And then I have to go back. I'm not sure what's going on with this slide, but you see this is a little cart right there. It's interesting to read census reports because sometimes they'll write in the margin. You have little marginality. And this particular census taker wrote, "These guys live in boxcars." Well, yes, they did, but they were retrofitted for living. They were basically an early form of the fifth wheel. There were 16 bunks in there. They had lockers and they had heat. And the Japanese were able to stay on railroad property away from the populace, so kind of protected them from violence, basically. So let's talk about Cheyenne's Japanese town. Cheyenne's Japanese town here. You see the little red dotted line, that's the traditional Japanese town that's accepted. It's around 17th Street and 18th Street. I'm not going to get in very much detail because Alan Ohashi actually did a very detailed study on this. He has a book coming out, and PBS is coming out with a program on Japanese community in November, so tune in for that. Well, through my studies, I found out Japanese Town was a little more extensive than that. It went from 10th Street, and you had some outliers there around 20th Street, some on 24th, 25th. But the majority laid within that box right there. Now, this one here is the more interesting one, is right down in here where the railroad, wow, we are really in some issues. This one, you think he had everything ready. Okay, the blue. This isn't anything about red state, blue state, by the way. So the little blue box right there, this came from a question that Jim over here had. He told me a story. He says, my dad used to tell me about the Japanese who lived down in the bottoms. What do you know about it? I said, I don't know. I'll find out. And that's why we're having this discussion today. Well, this is from 10th Street to 12th Street. There was some housing there. You won't find them on maps, but that was part of Japanese Town. Right over here on this side here, you had railroad cars. But on the other side, I think you physically had built a wooden structure there, a house, a section house. I do know that they had a flood in 1904 that kind of destroyed possibly some of that area there. And we think the housing looks just like that, where these Japanese women are standing behind. That was from a diary that Susie found and shared with me. And we'll talk about the diary in a little bit. And here's why I think this is housing at the bottom. Because these women are standing on railroad property, and if you look right behind the telephone pole there, you see a sign that says Steam Shop, South Steam Shop or South Shop of some sort. And housing was free, so you had to maximize your expenses. So if you look right here, from here down to here, these are how many Japanese lived in one house. You're talking about 15 of them. The houses were probably 450 square feet, so in one bathroom. So the Japanese did try to assimilate into the schools, and the community of Cheyenne actually tried to assimilate the Japanese as well. So we have Japanese attending schools, even though it was legal for Japanese to attend schools in California. We have Iwao Fukushima and his sister Minako. They were two of the students at Cheyenne High.
What year is that?
Yeah, what year?
1917, correct. And a little story about Wow, he was kind of a daredevil. He liked to race motorcycles, and he participated in many motorcycle rallies here in Cheyenne. His sister was kind of a social butterfly. But as far as Japanese assimilation, churches did a lot to try to assimilate the Japanese. First thing they did was they tried to convert them. And this particular program here pertains to the Baptist Church, the women's ministry. In 1923, they started an Americanization program to teach Japanese families English, teach them American-style cooking, sewing, and other customs. This is a page from one of the diaries, And you notice there's some names down there. Well, this is the most interesting name. This is Frank Emerson. Her husband was the governor of Wyoming from 1927 to 1931. And so you can see, and there's another page here. This woman is at church and she says, well, I don't see the governor, where is he? And this woman said, well, he's at the legislature. She goes, well, what's the legislature? And so they took the Japanese to go see how Wyoming's political process was. And so that was part of the Americanization of Japanese. Then we have Lakeview Cemetery. Now, Lakeview Cemetery, we have a place called Potter's Field. That's toward the very back of the cemetery. And that's where the people that couldn't afford to pay for burials, they were buried there, or if the body wasn't claimed. Well, there are several Japanese buried in that area. And Robin and I were going through some records. We found out there's probably like 90 people, Japanese buried in both Potter's Field and in a plot called the Japanese plot. So we have Potter's Field, we have the stillborn plot, and then a little toward the north you have the Japanese plot. So there's 33 buried in the Japanese plot. The headstones are a combination of Japanese, and English, or just English. So you can see the assimilation into the culture there. There are a lot of headstones with Christian symbols on there, such as a cross, the dove, or a lamb. And if you look at the early burials there, most of them are railroad related. They were squished by trains, or they were in some sort of horrific accident, such as this one. This one took place in 1908 in Bory, which is about 9 miles west of Cheyenne. Now what happened is there was a steam engine coming down from Sherman, and it lost its air brakes. So there's no way to stop it. It was just gaining momentum. Well, unfortunately, this train full of Japanese workers pulled in front of it at Bory, and there was a collision. There were 6 railroaders, and they say, and 3 Japanese killed. Not 9 people killed, but 6 and 3. So kind of shows you the disparity that Japanese faced here in Wyoming. Now, so the 3 Japanese were buried in what would be Potter's Field. Through the records, we found out that one of them was later exhumed in about 1929, and his body was sent to Denver for cremation. So that kind of tells us that there was no cremation services available at this time, up until 1929. Then we presume the body was shipped back to Japan. He did have $600 in his estate, which is equivalent to $17,000 today. So we assume some of that, the proceeds there went to pay for the cremation and the shipment back to Japan. And not everyone buried in the Japanese plot is Japanese. You can't tell it from this headstone here because it's written in Japanese characters. This one belongs to Sadie Nokagawa. She was a German woman of some means. She was married to a Japanese man who was a gambler. Well, over in the 500 block of 17th Street, they got into an argument one day about infidelity. And her husband took a knife and plunged it into her neck and killed her. So, and then he escaped. I tracked him through Green River in Utah and lost track of him from there. So, if you ever go to the Japanese plot, just remember, not everyone buried there is Japanese. So we come to the end of our program, which is good because I'm going to try. I love the Wyoming State Archives. I hope you do too. If you ever plan to do some research at the archives, this is some information for you. If you want a little more knowledge about Japanese and Japanese in Wyoming, visit heartmountain.org. And again, Beyond Heart Mountain by Alan Ohashi will be broadcasting in November on PBS. It will deal with Cheyenne's Japanese community. These are the people I'd like to thank, particularly Jim for starting this whole dialogue. And then these are the resources I used during my research here at the archives. And down at the bottom, we are looking for some information. Again, Robin and I are working with someone named Catherine. Her grandfather was one of the farmers in Sheridan. Catherine's done a tremendous job of researching it, but we're trying to see what else is out there. So if you have any information on Kasaburo Okazaki or Kasaburo Kimura, they're the same person, please send me a message and so we can follow up on the research. I appreciate that. So that kind of concludes our discussion for today. I'm going to turn it over to Robin. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. This is a good time for questions, and we're live streaming this on Facebook also, so we're going to have our Facebook people drop a question into the box if they have any questions, and I'll start it.
Yes.
Is there only one Japanese plot at Lakeview?
Yes, it's a full section. It's in section 6, which is kind of the southeast corner. Maury would be over here, and then you'd have Schrader Funeral Home over here. That's kind of the location it is, where it is. That's the historic one. Other Japanese that have died after that have been integrated into the cemetery. Correct.
I thought I had seen headstones with.
Yes.
Presumed they were.
But they specifically refer this to as a Japanese plot because of the headstones and the location. So,
If
yes.
the German lady's husband left town, who paid for a beautiful tombstone?
Well, generally, they would probably take a collection up from the Japanese community, is what it appears.
For a
to be.
German lady.
Yes, because she was married to a Japanese, and they probably felt very sorry for her. And the Japanese are very loving people, as are Americans. So there was most likely a collection taken up. And actually, here's the story. She probably paid for her own headstone because at the time, the newspapers made a very big deal about this, that she was wearing fur, she was wearing silk, she had diamond rings and a bag of diamonds around her neck. So she probably paid for her own service. But the Japanese community probably arranged for the headstone to be made. So, thank you. Yes, sir.
When the first workers came over, were they primarily all men?
Yes, there are very few. In my research, and I have to go to the 1910 census, there are only 3 Japanese women, and they were single. So.
And when there were so many of them living together in the same housing, were they mixed, or were they just men, or were they families?
Well, traditionally they were men, but in the area down by the roundhouse, it appears that there were families living there as well. So, but again, very crowded, very crowded.
So the workers eventually sent for their families and had them come over?
Yes, some of them did that. So now the reason why they came over, you think $1.25 a day is not a lot of money, but Japan was economically depressed. For 200 years, they were a closed society. They shut out everyone except for the Chinese and the Dutch. So when they reopened in 1853, their economy is, they had no economy basically. A Japanese immigrant coming to Wyoming to work for the railroad, making $1.25, made twice as much as what he could in Japan. So he could earn a living, he could send some home, and that would allow the families to come over. So
When the families did come over, did the women work, or did they stay home and take care of the children?
well, it appears most of them stayed home, took care of the children, but they probably did some sewing, cooking for the men, things like that. So it became a community as well. So did I answer your question then?
Mike?
Yes.
Yes, you did.
Okay, thank you.
Can
Yes.
you tell a little more about your family history?
Well, we lived in England prior to coming to the United States. We came because the military brought us. And so now as far as I can share some about the Americanization program because my mom did go through attend some of those programs here in Cheyenne.
Was she Japanese?
100%. She's from Hokkaido. And I remember reading in the diary, which is actually out behind where Bev is, about them teaching the Japanese women how to make scalloped potatoes and ham. My mom came home and made scalloped potatoes and ham. My mom came home and taught us how to make popcorn balls because that's what she learned. And and one of the women that was part of this program, Mrs. Allen, she died before we actually got to the United States. But the house we grew up, she would have been our neighbor. I remember her son living across the street. And my second grade teacher, Mrs. Adolphson, was part of this program.
Oh, really?
I saw her name and said, "Oh, I know her." So, but other than that, I can't. Corlett, yes, over in the hood. And so, but other than that, I don't have any roots in Wyoming other than back to 1965, and I still don't have roots. I have two brothers and a sister. So
I would say that you look like Japanese.
yes, I guess you would say genealogists would say I'm 50%, and so yes, ma'am.
Did they avail themselves to the healthcare system, or did they have special remedies and they pretty well took care of each other, or what?
Good question. That was something I really
She's a nurse.
that was something that I really tried to look up. Now there was this. I'm going to kind of give you the long answer here. There was a Japanese contractor here by the name firm here, Wakamoto Nishimura. They were one of the largest. They employed about 1,500 Japanese from like Omaha to Wyoming and Colorado. They actually built a hospital for the Japanese here on 15th Street. It had 2 wards. It had they paid for a doctor and 2 nurses. Yes. So yes, they did have their own hospital health care. And they could also use, at the time it would have been St. John's Hospital. So. Yeah.
Dan, Congress passed a law in the 1880s that forbid Japanese people to come to the United States. How did these people work around that?
Well, actually, that was, I believe you're referring to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882. And so that only applied to the Chinese.
No, it was Japanese also.
Well, the Japanese, the gentleman's agreement in 1907 restricted. But it restricted immigrant workers. If you were a professional, a student, a doctor, a lawyer, something like that. But you can say, I'm a student, I want to go to the United States. And then you can, find employment. And also, they would emigrate to places like Canada or Mexico.
And then come in through there.
Yes, building a wall wasn't an option back then. Yes, sir.
What year did it change when they were allowed to own land?
That was, I'm not sure, probably in the 20s or 30s, actually. I'm focusing from 1900 to 1920, but that, if you want to leave me some your contact information, I'll certainly check that out and respond to you.
That's okay,
Okay, but off the top of my head, I don't know. Everything kind of revolved around what was California doing. They were kind of the major players. They were the ones that said, Japanese can't own land. During World War II, they're saying, the Japanese are combatants, let's take their land, let's put them in relocation camps, and strip them of their civil liberties. So everything pretty much was driven by California. And I would say the 1920s, like 1924, may be the answer. I could be wrong on that, I'm not definite. So, other questions? Yes, Rick?
That riot in Laramie, was there an event that started that riot?
No, it seems like the Laramie boys, they're just looking for something to do on Saturday night. So they said, let's go attack the Japanese, and they did. Nothing provoked them. That was about the same time that the riots were taking place in San Diego and, up the West Coast. So I think that probably had something to drive that riot there. Other questions? Yes.
At the start of the presentation, you mentioned why the UP liked them as workers. Could one reason also have been that they were not going to join a union with the other workers, and so therefore they were a little safer in that regard?
That is correct, because they were not allowed to join unions. Except for there is this case in Rock Springs with the miners union where someone I met, one of her relatives actually led the miners' strike in Rock Springs, where they were able to join the union later on. So he ended up at one of the more notorious relocation camps for that. So, other questions?
Did any of the Japanese have to go to Hard Mountain during the month?
There were some, but generally it was the Japanese on the West Coast that they were more concerned about. I mean, we didn't really have a lot of population here. I'm sure some of them ended up there. I've heard stories that some of them were able to keep their jobs here. So I haven't really looked into it, and honestly, the best source for that would be the heartmountain.org, because again, my focus is from 1900 to 1920. I'm trying to figure out why the Japanese left in 1920. They left for the Colorado beet fields and other better paying jobs, and some of them did return home. And Beth, did you have a question?
I did. Do you know the history of the Ohashis and Tom Miyamoto?
I do not. I'm not real familiar with a lot of the Japanese in town. So.
We'll hook him up.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I can turn it back over to Robin. No, Susie, no question? No Facebook questions?
No, there is one gal that said that she's watching from home, and to thank you for presenting today. She spent some time at Heart Mountain, and was it really made an impact on her. So she was really excited to listen to your talk today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your tuning in.
Very cool. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Ron.
And also, as in the past talks, Susie and I believe Jim put together a display case that you will see the diary that Dan references in his presentation. And we have cookies, snacks, so you're welcome to visit, and you're welcome to visit with Dan and take a look at the case. And also, remember that his book is available at the museum store when it's open. Thank you very much for
They
coming.
know how to get a hold of me.
Yeah.
Thank you.